Good evening, everyone, and welcome to everyone here in the room and also those joining online. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's public lecture as part of the BAP summer meeting. For those of you who don't know us, the British Association for Psychopharmacology exists to promote research and education in psychopharmacology with the ultimate aim of improving the lives of people affected by mental illness. An important part of that mission is making sure that the best available scientific evidence reaches beyond academic journals and conferences to the public. As researchers, many of us spend our time generating evidence, but unless that evidence is communicated clearly, accurately, and thoughtfully, it can't inform patients, families, clinicians, policymakers, or the wider public. That's why the BAP is committed not only to supporting that excellent science, but also to recognising excellence in communicating the science in that science. So before we begin this evening's lecture, we'd like to celebrate 3 outstanding examples of public engagement. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Samir Johar to the stage to present the first BAP Public Engagement Prize.
Thank you, Susie, and as ever, she's articulated everything a lot clearer and better than I'm going to. So, the people that I chose, or that I communicated to BAP in regard to this award, were Melanie and Heston Blumenthal. And it's deliberate that it's Melanie and Heston Blumenthal. If I give you some idea from my perspective of why I think, or I thought, it would make sense for this. So I interviewed Heston for the BBC programme they did, Heston, My Life with Bipolar. And I have to say, I'm very glad that I was on the cutting room floor and not in the programme. Because the programme was not about this, it wasn't about the science of bipolar or treatments or any of that side of things. It was about people's experiences of bipolar. And that's the first time I was introduced to Melanie. And her description was raw, courageous, and compassionate. She described what it's like to have someone with severe mental illness close to you, to look after them, to look after someone with severe mania, and then make a decision that I don't think many of us could actually make, to ask for compulsory treatment when you know that the person closest to you is really unwell. And I have little doubt that she probably saved his life in that regard. And that's what drew me into what they did. That's what made me think about the public communication side of things. Heston has articulated well enough through all the other mediums, be it BBC, Guardian. I don't know about the social media stuff because we don't do that anymore, thankfully. In regard to his own experience of how it was. But it was really Melanie's input, I think, that struck me. And then the day before we had to put our nominations in, we shared a symposium for Bipolar UK. And in that symposium, there was not a dry eye in the hybrid house. You know, she was so clear, compassionate, but honest about what it's like and what the journey's like. Honest about the treatments, what they do and what they don't do. And communicated and conveyed that also much better than we do. And it's not her native tongue either. So really, those were the reasons I thought it was worth nominating them. And I guess the other side of it, and I'm really grateful to BAP Council for doing this, is we always think of the person, but we sometimes forget about family carers, and we also forget that it's the women who keep things going generally, and they keep things running, and we sometimes forget about that. So, as Susie said, we do our research, we do guidelines, the BAP guidelines in bipolar will be coming out. We do, and I think 3 people in the world might think that's very good. But when someone articulates their story, is open, honest, and compassionate, well then you do get people to change their minds in regard to things. And I think that's something we all aspire to. So thank you very much, Melanie, and your other half for contributing to this. And thank you, Council, for giving this award to them.
Thank you, Samir. We're also delighted to present 2 additional BAP Public Communication Prizes, recognising members who have made exceptional contributions to bringing evidence-based psychopharmacology and mental health research to wider audiences. Our Training Member Public Communication Prize goes to Riddhi Laijawala from King's College London. Riddhi has shown an outstanding commitment to making mental health research accessible and engaging to the public. Through her work with Inspire the Mind, where she is social media managing editor, she's translated complex research into clear, engaging articles and digital content, helping people understand the relevance of mental health science to their everyday lives. She's used innovative approaches across digital and social media to communicate evidence-based mental health research to a broad public audience, including work on perinatal mental health. Congratulations, Riddhi. Our full member Public Communication Prize goes to Dr Will Lorne from King's College London. Unfortunately, Will isn't able to be with us this evening, so the prize will be collected on his behalf by Cat Bird. Will has made an exceptional contribution to improving public understanding of cannabis and mental health. A particular highlight has been his evidence-based cannabis assemblies for secondary schools, which have already reached around 2,600 students across 11 schools. Alongside this, he's communicated research through public events, podcasts, national media, and widely viewed online science videos, always with a commitment to presenting balanced, nuanced, evidence-based information on a topic that is often polarised. Many congratulations, Will, and thank you for accepting the award on his behalf, Kat. Or not, we'll give it to her later. So, on to the main event of the evening. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce this year's BAP Public Lecturer, Dr Lucy Foulkes. Lucy is a Prudence Trust Research Fellow at the University of Oxford and one of the UK's most thoughtful and influential voices on adolescent mental health. Her research explores how young people's mental health develops, but I think what makes Lucy particularly special is her ability to communicate that science beyond academia. Through her research, writing, media appearances and books, she's become one of the UK's most trusted voices on adolescent mental health, with a remarkable ability to distill complex evidence into thoughtful, balanced and accessible insights for parents, teachers, clinicians, policymakers and young people alike. As a parent myself of a couple of tweens, it's always really exciting when I see that Lucy's put something up on Instagram. I always gravitate towards it because it's really practically useful for a parent like me, and it really gives this very balanced view on what can be a very difficult subject to understand. And more generally, at a time when these conversations about adolescent mental health were often dominated by sensational social media posts and strongly held opinions, I think Lucy brings clarity, balance and compassion while remaining firmly grounded in the evidence. And these qualities make her exactly the kind of communicator we want to celebrate this evening, and we're delighted that she's agreed to give this year's public lecture. So before I hand over to Lucy, I just want to highlight that after Lucy has spoken, we'll be open for questions. You can submit questions through the Slido app if you'd like to, using the QR code that's on the screen now. Please capture it before we go on to Lucy's slides. We will welcome questions from those in the room, but also those joining us online. So please do grab the QR code as well. And I'm delighted to be joined as co-chair today by Rita Kersnikite, who's a member of our Experts by Experience panel. So she will be co-chairing at the end and helping with the questions. So thank you, and please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Lucy Foulkes.
Hi, thank you so much. It's so nice to get some positive feedback about Instagram, because I admire anyone who regularly posts on Instagram. It takes so much time and effort, and then you do it, and then inevitably someone doesn't like what you've said. So I haven't been doing it for a while, so it's very nice to realise someone's out there who is appreciating it, so thank you. So thank you so much for coming to hear me talk today. It's not about psychopharmacology, but I think it's okay. This is about public communication, so that's fine. This felt like a good idea when I was making the slides. I decided to go back through my old photo albums to find some photos of when I was at Birmingham. So I came here for my undergraduate in 2006, so almost exactly 20 years ago now. And I found a photo. This is me with my housemates outside my house in Selly Oak. So anyone who's local to the area will know that's where all the students live. It was down one of those kind of tiny, narrow alleyways, kind of squashed in between the other roads. I also had a little look to see if I could find any photos of inside my house, and I found this. And it's an interesting reminder of what you think is an acceptable ratio of number of people to invite relative to the space that you have available. That's me sat by the kitchen bin, if you haven't spotted me already. But yeah, so I have lots of positive memories of Birmingham, so it's lovely to be back here giving this talk. It's also worth saying, sorry, I'm out of breath, that we're still adolescents here. Most of us were, I think this was the start of second year, so most of us were 19, maybe a few of us were 20, so very much still adolescents, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So this is what I'm focusing on in this talk. So I want to ask these two big questions. What is it like being an adolescent? And also, what is it like being an adolescent today? So if we want to understand mental health, then really we have to understand what adolescence is more generally. So I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about that, and then moving on to talk more about mental health and about my work. So what is adolescence? Well, I like thinking about what are you when you at the beginning of adolescence, before adolescence. So you're a prepubescent child that is very dependent on adults to look after you. And then by the end of it, you ideally are a kind of fully functioning adult who's capable of navigating the world, and particularly social relationships, on your own, away from your family. So adolescence is all about the processes in between. So it's this massive transformation that needs to happen between a kind of vulnerable child and an independently functioning adult. It's difficult to agree on the exact age that we're talking about, but very broadly, generally the research tends to talk about 10 to 24 as being adolescence. The most important thing about adolescence is that it's a period of massive social reorientation. So your brain and your mind starts to shift away from your family unit as being important and towards your peers. So you're not yet ready to be a fully functioning adult on your own. So your peers become a kind of halfway house, this kind of new group where you can belong as you gradually take steps to exist in the world away from your parents. Here's a few example photos of what that looks like in teenagers. Is that the last one? Yeah, okay, I think that feels like the most accurate one. The stock images of adolescents are generally far too sanitized and happy. So the important thing about the social reorientation is that you start to become deeply interested in what your peers are doing. You track what they're doing, you care a lot about what they're doing, and you care a lot about whether you belong in this group, so whether this group has accepted you. Oh, there's another one there. This means often you have to follow a lot of rules. You have to notice what your peer group has decided as being socially acceptable and not socially acceptable, and then you try to follow those rules so that you can fit in, or at least so that you're not ostracized or rejected from the group. This affects everything. So this idea of tracking and caring about what your peers think, it affects who you are willing or able to make friends with. It affects romantic relationships, who is considered to be acceptable to date. It affects it's amazing how judgmental teenagers are about what music you are and are not allowed to listen to. Same with TV, same with hobbies. They don't even want to engage in hobbies that are deemed uncool, even if their friends wouldn't know that they're doing it. obvious ones is that about the clothing, about what hairstyles they wear. If you see a group of teenagers together, look at their shoes. I always think it's interesting that they always wear the same shoes. Even if their outfit has deviated a little bit from each other, they tend to be quite uniform with what shoes they're wearing. And then their thoughts and their opinions. So we know from lots of research that teenagers are more influenced by their peers' thoughts and opinions than adults are. And then the obvious one, risky behaviour. So they take lots of risks for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that their friends are doing it and then they feel that they have to do it to fit in. And then the worst side of this is bullying, in that bullying becomes a group process where people continue with the bullying or at least don't intervene with it because it's deemed to be something that has been established within the group, particularly people who are more powerful in the group. I want to talk more about this, but very briefly, social influence is not equal across a peer group. There are some young people in schools that have more influence than others. They're not necessarily the most liked people, but they have the most status and the most power and the most visibility. And these mean girls are a classic example. One thing I like saying about adolescence is that peer pressure gets thrown around as being a kind of cliche adolescent behaviour, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer because it's quite rare that you'll actually get a teenager forcing another teenager to do something else. Often the second teenager will be influenced without any necessary obvious coercion. And I really like this quote about peer pressure. So saying peer pressure doesn't really exist in the way we think it does, and that instead when a young person is influenced by their peers, they're doing it kind of intentionally. It's a consciously employed strategy to enhance personal and social power. So if they start smoking because their friend was smoking, they often are doing that sort of intentionally. There is so much else going on, so I'm very interested in the social side of things, but this is happening in a context of a lot of other change and disruption. So their bodies are transforming within a few years. Their body looks and feels totally different. Romantic and sexual relationships begin at some point during adolescence generally. They're also suddenly discovering the real world. So in childhood, people go to great efforts, understandably, to protect young people from learning about all the awful things that exist. But gradually, across adolescence, you have to start finding these things out. They're also in this kind of bind where they desperately want to be independent and they want autonomy, but they're in a system, i.e. school, and also often in the home, where there's lots of rules and they're very kind of constrained and restricted, and that's very frustrating. Then, on top of that, they have exams, when I think there's not really very many comparisons in adulthood where one day or a few days can have quite such a big impact on your future or be quite so disruptive if you can't turn up on that day or something goes wrong. So basically, they're under an enormous amount of pressure and stress and change. So it should be no surprise that this is a period of risk for developing mental illness. So I'm going to show you very briefly, this graph from a nice big study recently that looks at 150,000 participants from across the world, and it tracked at what age does various different mental illnesses tend to begin. So what you're seeing at the bottom is the age. Along the bottom, along the side, is basically a metric to say at what age does mental illness most likely begin. Generally looks at what's your likelihood at each age of developing a mental illness, looking just at the people who haven't yet developed one. So what you can see here says boys are blue and males are blue and females are green, and it's basically peaks around age 15. It's really interesting if you look at different disorders, it says different things. If you're going to develop an anxiety disorder, it's probably going to start most likely in childhood. Depression and schizophrenia is more kind of 19, 20. Substance abuse tends to be a bit later. But this is if you combine everything together, it tends to be this sort of age. Two disorders very clearly do tend to start in teenage years specifically. One is eating disorders, and the other is social anxiety disorder. And social anxiety disorder has been referred to as the prototypical anxiety disorder because it kind of takes a typical adolescent experience of caring a lot about what your peers think, and then it kind of completely goes off the rails in terms of you become chronically and hugely disrupted by worry about what other people think of you. This is really important, and I think sometimes this gets lost, and I almost feel like it feels a bit controversial to say this at the moment, but most young people, most adolescents do not develop mental illness. The majority of them do not have a mental illness if we're talking about reaching the level of symptoms and disruption that would meet criteria for a diagnosis. All the things I just talked about now can make adolescence very difficult and very stressful for a lot of young people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they develop mental illness. Now I want to talk about what's new. So what is happening now? What is it like being a teenager today that might have changed what we've just been talking about? It's really important to remember that all of that stuff is still happening. Often when I speak to adults who are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, talking back to their teenage years, it's the same themes that come up. So it's not new that young people are worried about what people think of them and who they are and fitting in with the world. That has always been the case. It's just presenting itself in slightly different ways in each generation. You will be familiar with all of these headlines. There has been an enormous amount of interest in the idea that we are in the midst of an adolescent mental health crisis. Interestingly, I remember about 10 years ago headlines like this, and then COVID happened, and then there was a lot of talk about COVID causing a kind of fresh crisis, and now we still often hear these headlines. So there's been this concern for some time that this is kind of the worst time in recent history to be an adolescent in terms of mental health. This is true to an extent. So this is true if you look at all the different ways that we measure it. So whether you ask people to self-report symptoms, whether you track how many people are going to the GP, whether you ask parents to report on their child's mental health, everything is showing that we have higher rates of symptoms now than we did maybe 5 or 10 years ago in adolescence. Oh, there's one more there. Oh, 2 more. Okay. So the big question is why, and there is so much interest at the moment. I'm involved in a couple of projects, both nationally and internationally, that's trying to understand this question. Why are so many people, so many more young people now reporting mental health problems, seeking help for mental health problems, seeking adjustments for mental health problems than in the recent past? Everyone has a slightly different answer to this question, but I'm going to lay out how I understand it. And I think there are 3 options, and you don't have to pick one. I think it's a bit of everything happening at once. The first is straightforwardly that it really is worse to be a teenager now than it was in the past. They really do have more mental health problems now. The second is that we're just better at identifying it now. So the problem was always there, but we just now feel more able to come forward about it and talk about it, which is a good thing, but it will obviously create the impression that rates have gone up. And then there's this idea of overdiagnosis, which I've put in quotes, because overdiagnosis is really a sort of clinician criticism, but actually I think in society when this word gets thrown around, what people are criticising is really they're saying individuals themselves are inappropriately and excessively adopting labels about mental health problems when perhaps they don't meet criteria for that, or they're sort of misunderstanding common distress as being symptomatic of a disorder. So those are the kind of 3 main categories of answer as I see it. I'm going to go through each of them now, but when we get to the first one, we're going to have a little pause and think about phones, because when we talk about why might mental health problems really be worse now, the most obvious thing that everyone talks about is phones. Phones, social media, digital tech, all the terms slightly overlap, but broadly, you know the general thing that I'm talking about. So I could talk for hours about this, but I'm going to just very briefly give an overview of what I think about this, and then point you in the direction of some resources if you're interested in understanding more about this. And then I'm going to come back to the rest of my list. So the first thing I want to say is that this book by Jonathan Haidt really started a very big conversation about phones and social media. And his argument has been summarised in the front here, which is that that smartphones are causing an epidemic of mental illness. This book has been heavily criticised by everyone who works in this field. He is not a social media researcher, neither am I. All the people who research social media have criticised this book for being unhelpful. So if you want to understand what's happening with how phones impact teenagers' mental health, I'd recommend looking beyond this book, and I'll give you some examples. I was thinking, what's the most simple way that I can summarise it? I think that feels quite neutral. The criticism towards him generally is that he's not entirely wrong. Like, phones are problematic and they cause distress, but the relationship between phone use and mental health is small and complicated. So the criticism is that he has cherry-picked and oversimplified research to tell a simple story and to tell a really frightening story. And I think partly what frustrates me about this book and its enormous popularity is that how much he has scared parents, and he has told them a problem and sold them a solution which they cannot implement because phones are too widely embedded in our world now. So I think he's caused a lot of distress without offering a helpful solution. This is what generally I think about phones. What all the research actually tells us is, despite our intuitions that they might be bad for teenagers, the research doesn't reflect that. The research reflects a complicated picture that they are both good and bad, sometimes in the same session, that actually depends enormously on what you're doing with your phone and the various different circumstances and context of what you're doing on your phone and what is happening in your life. There's massive individual differences. So for some young people, phones are more problematic than for other young people. We know that young people who have mental health problems use their phones in a different way. It's not such a big relationship that it can be the entirety of the explanation of why young people are reporting more mental health problems now. And it's also not straightforwardly in the direction that Jonathan Haidt suggested. So when you see a relationship between phone use and mental health problems, there is some evidence that it's the mental health problems driving problematic phone use rather than the other way around, depending on exactly what study you look at. But so there's massive individual differences, and if you have a teenager who's using their phone in a really problematic way, there's probably a cyclical relationship between what's happening for them individually and what they're seeing on their phone. I love this quote by Emily Setti, which is that often adults, we imagine that it's something we can just remove from their world, but actually their online and offline worlds are kind of fully integrated now, and they live in a post-digital reality, is what she said. So they don't see it as like their online world, it's just their world. My view is that owning a phone is a life skill now, and one of the things that we need to help gradually teach adolescents as they gradually develop into independent adults. I fully appreciate none of that is straightforward, and I think parenting now, the greatest challenge of parenting today and for the last 10 years is about how you navigate digital tech use. So I fully understand that it's not easy, but it's more nuanced than Haidt suggests. I won't go into this, but if you're interested in understanding why the under 16 social media ban probably won't have the effect that we hope it will in terms of reducing mental health problems, I'd really encourage this paper, you reading this paper. It's open access, very easily accessible for a wider audience. And that's just a quote to sum it up there. And then the senior author, Candice Odgers, has just done a great TED Talk. It's only about 15 minutes, saying similar things which you might be interested in reading. I've been asked so many times about Haidt alternatives that I've made a folder of them. So these are all general audience articles about exploring Haidt's views and alternatives. So that is there. If you want books that are more helpful and hopeful from a parenting perspective, I'd recommend all three of these, particularly the middle one. If you are parenting adolescents, it really embeds understanding of adolescent development into tech use. I have also done a 45-minute online talk about a different way of thinking about phones, so I've included that here as well. Okay, that's the phone bit. We can go back now. So, why are rates increasing? So we're thinking about this first one, that things really are worse now. So why might that be? What might be different about today's generation? We've covered phones. There's no straightforward evidence that suggests it's any one of these things, but there's bits and pieces suggesting that all of them might be contributing. So I've added there the idea of academic pressure and school stress. If you actually ask teenagers what they're most worried about, schoolwork often comes out at the top or near the top. Financial stress, financial insecurity, relative poverty, where young people have less money than their peers, and the stress that causes. So the financial insecurity is definitely different now relative to the past, or young people are growing up in households where that's a big stress. Related possibilities, there's less protective factors now, so things that used to bolster young people's mental health is being stripped away. This is apparently a youth centre, or it was, so lots and lots of youth centres have closed down, so places where young people can gather and build community are being taken away. There's some evidence that there's less sense of neighbourhood cohesion now than there was in the past, a sense of community where you live, or safety where you live. And then the argument, which Haidt also talks about, which is that parents are being more protective now for teenagers in a way that's ultimately unhelpful because it's preventing them from experimenting in the world and building their resilience. So there's been bits and pieces of supporting all of this. Then COVID came along, didn't affect everyone equally, but it certainly, adolescent mental health took a hit. Most research show that it's come back again, but it hasn't come back for everyone. People were very differentially affected. So this is obviously relevant for this generation relative to past generations. Now we're going to move on to talking about 2 and 3, which are kind of the things I'm most interested in. So this idea that we're just better at identifying it now, maybe teenage mental health problems have always been there. We just didn't talk about it. And I find this really interesting speaking to older adults now about their adolescence. And actually some of them had incredibly difficult times. So the idea that it was easy in the past just isn't accurate when you actually ask the right questions. It's just that people weren't having the same kind of conversations about this then. There has been a transformation now in the last 5-10 years in our willingness and our desire to talk about mental health, particularly young people's mental health, which has come from a very good place because we know it's a period of risk. But the argument goes that the underlying problem hasn't changed, it's just that we're talking about it more now. I should clarify, this isn't a competing theory with number one. I think both things can be happening at the same time. So let's talk about mental health awareness, which is what I've been interested in for a long time, and this idea that we've been encouraged to talk more about it. Here are some visuals about mental health awareness campaigns that you will all have seen. So that's some childhood ones. This is, if you go to visit a school now, there are posters like this everywhere. Anyone who works in a university will be familiar that student mental health is a popular topic now. And then you get this kind of advert public transport. And this was the kind of OG of mental health awareness campaigns back in 2011, and they really tried to make the point that I've never really liked this stat because mental health problem as a term is quite vague, but they were obviously trying to make the point it's more common than you think it is. So all of these campaigns are encouraging us to notice what might be a mental health problem in you, to talk about it, to label it, to seek help for it, to go to a doctor about it, to ask your friend about their mental health, etc. So we're really being encouraged now, more than in the past, to talk about our mental health. These are actually 2025 dates, but I think there will be something similar for 2026. So I discovered a website which summarizes all the different awareness days for your diary. So you will see here that there are an awful lot of them. I couldn't fit them all on one page. But every kind of few weeks, there is a specific campaign encouraging you to notice and think about a specific aspect of mental health. A few years ago, I became very interested in this idea that this in itself might be contributing to the increased rates that we're seeing. So that number 2 and 3 that I mentioned. When I wrote this paper, I wanted to write it to kind of make the point that this is a question that we should be asking. It was exploratory. I wanted to emphasize in the title that it was exploratory. I posed it as a question. I said it's a hypothesis. I said we need to test it. But the reaction to this paper was far bigger. I was not used to anyone reading or talking about or noticing the things that I'd written before this. So the response it had was really unexpected. I had a lot of media attention, international media attention, about people wanting to write about this. I actually had an email this week from a journalist from a German newspaper who did an in-depth investigation of this, telling me that he's now got a book deal to write a book about this idea of talking about mental health and how it impacts us. But this is a kind of peak of interest in this paper, was this profile in the New York Times. Also, still not sure whether I should include this in talks, but I include it because it was surprising. I was looking up, because it has been cited in several policy documents. This is a White House document that has cited this paper. They were writing about potential problems with school mental health interventions, which I have previously written about and which there is evidence for, but for some reason they cited this paper. But anyway, it's had much more attention than I had anticipated. I want to talk a little bit about what I said in that paper now, the work I've been doing since, which has been testing this hypothesis. We wanted to make a kind of simple point, which was that there might be a bi-directional relationship between the increased reports in mental health symptoms that we're seeing. That leads to more public health bodies, charities, etc., launching public health mental awareness campaigns. But really we were interested in that, in the darker blue line, so the idea that actually the more mental health awareness you have, that possibly it would trigger more symptom reporting. I never wanted to make the argument that this was happening in the exclusion of all the genuine factors, but rather that it was one component that might be adding to what we're seeing. And we wrote about 2 possible routes. So the first we suggested is kind of the sort of the good one and the thing you would hope would happen, which is that if you raise people's awareness about mental health, you will improve their recognition of mental health problems that they have. And you'll reduce, a lot of the motivation was to destigmatize mental health problems. So actually, if you make people aware of mental health problems, you will encourage people to come forward and report symptoms that otherwise would have remained unreported. That was the whole point of the campaigns. It's a good thing, but it's also going to make the numbers increase. The second mechanism or route that we suggested, which has gained the most interest, is the idea that we speculated that if you encourage people to think all the time about their mental health and to notice it and to label it and talk about it, given the ambiguity of what mental health symptoms are, that you might inadvertently encourage people to interpret and report mild transient symptoms as signs of mental health problems or mental disorders, and that this, what we called overinterpretation, might in itself as well contribute to this increase. We also speculated in this paper that this process might lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which other people have speculated on as well, that once you adopt a label, you might then, it might then escalate those symptoms. But really that's quite a separate hypothesis, and Isaac Ahuvia in the States wrote a paper saying that's a separate hypothesis, and I agree with him. So I'm leaving it a little bit to the side here. it's really understandable that this would happen. Right now, I imagine I'm talking to an audience who is well aware of this, but I'll say it anyway. Mental health symptoms exist on a spectrum. You do not have people who have mental disorder and everyone else who's totally fine, okay? You have a gradually changing line where symptoms become more frequent, more severe, more difficult to control, more distressing, and really importantly, they start to disrupt your functioning, your life, that prevents you doing the things that you want and need to do. So we have pragmatically put a line somewhere up around the red end to say this is where depression begins or this is where anxiety begins. But actually there is a very messy spectrum in the middle. It would be very understandable if you were seeing lots of posters about depression to possibly misunderstand exactly what part of the spectrum you're on and what it's referring to. I'll include this quote by Piers Morgan, which is quite old now, but I always like it. So he tweeted, when Twitter was still alive, I'd never tell mentally ill people to man up, but I would say it to mentally healthy people who shirk dealing with normal life issues. So he is suggesting this neat binary, but the neat binary doesn't exist. It's actually very difficult when you get kind of middle cases to identify, you know, when we should say a problem has begun. Okay, so we laid it out as an idea. There were some initial clues then that there might be evidence in support of this. But I've been thinking about this a lot since then. I've also been doing lots of work in school mental health, which isn't appearing here, but I can talk about that in the questions if you're interested. So I'm going to show, I think, one study that investigated this idea, and in order to test the hypothesis, we decided let's just strip it back as much as we can and literally just test that thing, whether by showing people mental health awareness materials, can you induce them to report more symptoms? And we wanted to do it in an experimental paradigm, and so getting people into the lab and doing it in a very controlled way to test whether you can increase this reporting. So this is a study led by Isaac Winterburn, which is under review at the moment. And essentially we were asking this question, so we decided to take example charity posts from Instagram and say, what happens when you show people these posts and how does it affect how they report their symptoms? So participants were randomized to either look at just 10 of these posts. It wasn't a fancy, impressive design. They either looked at these mental health charity posts, or they looked at posts from charities about cycling as an attempt to find a reasonably neutral comparison. We then edited the control post to try and match the experimental condition visually, but by keeping the same information. I'll keep it brief because there's so much to talk about, but basically, we found that relative to the control group, the group of young adults who saw the anxiety-related posts, just 10 of them over a period of kind of 5-10 minutes, reported higher trait anxiety, controlling for their baseline trait anxiety. So they reported themselves to be more anxious people in general. They reported themselves to feel more anxious right now. They reported a broader concept breadth, which is that they considered the boundaries around what a mental illness is were a bit broader than in the cycling condition. But there was no difference in self-diagnosis. Now, these effect sizes were small, but I would expect them to be. I'm kind of amazed it happened at all, really, because it was, a very brief exposure. So I was running that study, which is now under review, whilst I was also invited to write this review, looking at all the other experimental evidence that exists that tests something related to this hypothesis. So briefly, this has also shown, so there's various different studies now in different groups around the world that repeat this idea that if you show people mental health awareness information, you can immediately induce them to report more symptoms than they were reporting before. It's a little bit messy because some people show newspaper adverts and some people show social media, and it's different social media posts and it's different disorders, etc. But broadly, you do get, there's several studies now showing this, which lots of labs now internationally are building on to look at this in more detail. But that if you look at mental health awareness information encouraging you to think about mental health, then you end up reporting either more symptoms or self-diagnosis, so that you believe yourself to be more likely to have this disorder. So that's a kind of experimental evidence where you strip everything back and look at it in loads of detail in the lab. But there's also evidence from the real world. So there has been some nice studies that track in the population what people think about mental health in the aftermath of a campaign being launched. So like the example campaigns I showed you. So it's been shown now, not just in the UK, but in Australia, in Canada in particular, those three. Stigma decreases, so in the years following a big national campaign, stigma towards people with mental health problems decreases. Knowledge of mental health problems increases. It's called mental health literacy, so this idea of people better understanding what mental health problems are. People report more willingness to seek help, so this intended help seeking. And there's also some evidence, I haven't got there, but they actually, that visits to a GP do go up in the aftermath of a campaign. So I think we can put these two things together to say that the basic premise of this hypothesis is supported, even though I think there's much more work to be done. And it's quite intuitive, really, that if you encourage people to notice, think about, talk about, label their mental health, that you do get a change in how people report and understand their mental health. Oh yeah, that direction. This we still don't really know, and when I wrote the paper, I had not appreciated how difficult it is in an experimental paradigm to fully tease apart these two mechanisms. So if you see someone increase their symptoms, are they now better understanding something that they had misunderstood 10 minutes ago or an hour ago, or are they actually now over-interpreting their symptoms? So this is what we're currently working on trying to unpick at the moment. So it's very much still a live hypothesis. However, I think it's reasonable to think there's probably a bit of both of these things going on. If you're interested in any of this stuff and you don't know Nick Haslam's work, look it up because it's brilliant. He's written about this idea of concept creep, which is that terms associated with harm like bullying, abuse, trauma, mental illness have expanded their boundaries recently, and you can track it in academic articles, in newspaper articles, etc. So I'm just going to briefly share this quote from him and Jesse, which I really like. And his reviewing of the evidence is that people have become better at recognizing the presence of mental illness, but may have become worse at recognizing its absence, which I think is a really nice summary of what I'm working on at the moment. I think there is some evidence for this overinterpretation bit, which is what people are particularly interested in. This is a really cool study in this area by Dasha. She, it's too long to talk about all of it, but she gave an ADHD awareness workshop to people who do not have ADHD, and she tested whether they self-diagnosed with ADHD by the end of it. She gave a control workshop about sleep to a second group of people. And what she found was that people in the ADHD group were more likely to self-diagnose with ADHD straight afterwards and a week later. And this was a group of people who do not have ADHD. So I think this is an important piece of evidence, one of the best pieces of evidence that we have so far, that this overinterpretation might be happening. Lastly, there's a bit of evidence of this overinterpretation idea from social media. So you may or may not be familiar with this, but there's a popular type of video on TikTok in particular, encourages people to identify symptoms of mental health problems that in themselves that they might not otherwise have realized. And people have looked now, they've looked at these videos, academics have done a content analysis on what's in the video and how people respond to it. And they have found both that the symptoms people give in these videos are often wrong, so they often choose traits that are not typically professionally considered to be symptomatic of a disorder, often with ADHD, but also with other disorders. And then you can track and you can measure what people are saying in real life in the comments underneath, and you get lots of people saying things like, I had no idea, I've got all 5, I didn't realize I had ADHD, etc. So we know from social media content analysis that some of the videos are wrong, and that equally that they're encouraging people to find these symptoms in themselves. So I think even though it's reasonably early days, I think I can be confident that this is happening some of the time, that this transformation in mental health awareness has encouraged people to identify symptoms in themselves, and that this has been a good thing and also in some cases an inaccurate thing. I wanted to spend the last bit of this really stressing something that I think gets missed and that repeatedly frustrates me when I see people talk either about my work or kind of adjacent ideas. We cannot blame teenagers or young people for doing this. It is completely understandable. It's a general human phenomenon that people want to understand what is happening to them when they're distressed, and that they are adopting the language that has been given to them. In fact, it's amazing how much teenagers get criticised for doing this, because it's adults that have given them this language for very well-intended reasons, but it's adults who have designed these public health campaigns. They are using the language that they have been given. And also, really importantly, some of them are doing it accurately. So I just gave some examples there about misinformation and inaccurate information on social media. But there's also other evidence that's tested who self-diagnoses with various different disorders. So they ask people, do you think you have this disorder? Even though you've not had a professional diagnosis, do you think you do? And actually the majority of people who self-diagnose are doing it correctly. They do meet the criteria for the disorder. And that shouldn't be surprising. Like, it's not difficult actually to have if you educate yourself on the information that's available, to have an intuition about what might be happening to you based on what you've read and what you're feeling, and that some of them are getting it right. So there's this real issue about self-diagnosis being assumed to be wrong by default. That's just not the case. A lot of them are doing it correctly, and we need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about this. I want to end on this. I mean, I could talk about self-diagnosis for ages, but I want to end on this study that I didn't conduct it. It was a master's student called Katie who was brilliant, and I supervised her to conduct it. And we wanted to ask clinicians, mental health professionals, what did they think about self-diagnosis? So I was inspired to do this study because I did a talk a few years ago, and a psychiatrist said to me that he spends more time now undiagnosing patients than diagnosing them. And that really planted a seed in my head, and I had a little bit of a look, and various other clinicians were theorizing and had this idea that self-diagnosis, people were turning up with a self-diagnosis, and then a sort of battle ensued where they had to convince them that this self-diagnosis was wrong. So I wanted to explore this in detail. This was an interview study. So we interviewed mental health professionals, not psychiatrists, but I'll get to them in a minute. So this was like, that's not criticism, like psychologists, psychotherapists, people working in schools, who were all working therapeutically with adolescents. And this is what they said. It really changed my viewpoint on this, because I was going in thinking they were all going to kind of let rip and really criticize people for self-diagnosis. So these were the 5 themes that we came up with. The first is that self-diagnosis stems from an inherent need to be understood. All of them were really compassionate about understanding why young people might turn up with a theory about what is happening to them, that it's a completely natural, understandable thing to want to understand what's going on and to have investigated that yourself. They also acknowledge that their access to diagnostic language has proliferated. So the culture that we're living in now, that is the norm. That's the way we talk about distress and dysfunction in psychology as we reach for psychiatric and mental health language. That wasn't always the case, but that's the norm now. So that language has proliferated. So this is the language that's available when they want to understand what's happening to them. This really interested me. They said most of the time it just doesn't matter, and not only is it neutral, but it's actually really interesting, it's really valuable. Even if they think maybe the self-diagnosis is wrong, it's so informative to understand why the young person thinks that might be the best label to describe what's happening to them. This also, I love, the word fades came up quite a few times across different interviews. This idea that often young people come in to a series of therapeutic sessions, holding on really tight to a self-diagnosis and it being very important to them. And that actually that starts to fade over the sessions if you give them space to actually listen to them, take them seriously, give them an alternative way of understanding what is happening to them. And of course, in parallel, you might hope that they're starting to get better over that time. This is all about mental health, by the way, not about neurodivergence. So not about autism, ADHD, self-diagnosis. That's a slightly separate phenomenon. But most of them did say that it can be a problem, but only when it becomes held onto too rigidly. So that there are some young people who arrive holding on very tight and they don't want to let go, and that actually that self-diagnosis becomes a framework through which they see everything that's happening to them and they don't want to let go of it. And it's that rigidity that can then start to cause friction and tension between the clinician and the patient and end up becoming what some of them refer to as a kind of negotiation. And then that starts to get in the way of the therapeutic process. But all of them stressed that this was a kind of minority, not that this was kind of what happens every time with self-diagnosis. Is that the end? Okay, we're starting to come to the end now. So I wanted to say, as I said at the beginning, that really you don't have to pick between one of these things. And actually there's evidence for all of it, and that it can all be happening in parallel. I've been in a lot of meetings, talks, discussions where real increases and a kind of measurement artifact are pitted against each other. Like, is it real or not? But actually it can be both, and different things are happening with different people. So let's come back to the question I asked at the beginning. It's really hard being an adolescent. I hope I've conveyed that. I think it's a really difficult period of life where there's a massive period of change. It can also be a really exhilarating, fun, creative, interesting period of life. But there's lots of reasons why we should respect it as being challenging, whether or not people develop mental health problems or not. What's it like being an adolescent today? Well, it is different, certainly. I think technology has been this transformative force, but it's not straightforwardly made adolescence worse. It's made it different, and it's certainly made it more difficult in some respects. But in other respects, in terms of lots of young people who might otherwise have been isolated or misunderstood, it's offered a real window into understanding the world and understanding themselves. I actually had a really interesting message on Instagram a few weeks ago when I talked about the social media ban, and a parent contacting me saying that her son, who was autistic, loved using YouTube for examining and exploring his special interest. She didn't tell me what that was. And he and they are now worried about how he would be able to continue to do that. And I thought it was just such a good example that we cannot make a kind of blanket assumption about what they're all doing on social media or how it might impact them if we take it away. I also want to end on a point to everyone, whether you're parenting or working with adolescents or researching them, is that we do need to take them seriously. They're so often judged and talked about, but actually if you speak to them, their lives are so rich, they're so nuanced in their perspectives. We've currently another paper under review where we interview 13 to 17-year-olds about self-diagnosis. such interesting, reflective, thoughtful, impressive answers where they understand all this kind of tension between the benefits and costs of self-diagnosis amongst their peers. So it's really just a cry to take them more seriously, I suppose. And also, lastly, to remember to have hope. There is so much attention at the moment about the mental health side of things, and it's appropriate that we think about and notice that. But it's not a it's not a universal experience as an adolescent to develop mental health problems. The majority of them do not, and actually, there's lots of reasons to celebrate this period of life as well. So I want to end on that to say thank you. Can I just briefly say a few thank yous, which is all the people who've contributed to the work on these pages, my funders. I've also written 2 books about this. So Coming of Age is more about adolescent experiences, and what mental illness really is more about the changing conversation about mental health. And I do occasionally post on Instagram if you want to follow me there. So thanks.
Thank you, Lucy. Very thought-provoking. From personal perspective, I've got 11-year-olds starting secondary school in September, so thank you for making sure I'll read up by September. We have loads of questions coming in. Some questions have extra thumbs up, so we think people probably share similar views and wanted to ask that, so we'll try and prioritize that. Hopefully, self-diagnosis and social media has been answered. You spent quite a bit of time on that, so we'll mark that as answered, I suppose. Can we just touch on gender gap? The question that came up was around, do you believe there is a gender gap in the adolescent mental health?
Yes, because the data shows us that there is. So more teenage girls report mental health problems than teenage boys. And there's some evidence that the increase that we're seeing is coming from girls rather than boys. I never spend a huge amount of time in it in my own work because I think sometimes it can artificially create a sense that these two genders have totally different experiences, when actually I think they have different versions of the same experience. But certainly, everything that we show suggests that girls are reporting more mental health problems, and there's various people debating on why that might be, in terms of, is it a hormonal thing, is it a reporting bias, is it something to do with sexism and them gradually navigating how to become women. I think there's not enough attention being paid to why girls are specifically reporting more than boys, but I also tend to stay away from it because I don't want that to create the impression that boys are fine, because some boys are struggling too.
Brilliant, thank you. So there's a question about whether there might be a utility to stigma. So what's the ideal level of stigma, and should we aim to get stigma to 0 or not, which I guess would be the implication of some of what you've talked about.
I really love that question. There is some evidence that stigma is starting to take it down. Stigma is starting to increase again, that actually that it started to improve up until about 2019, 2020, and now it's taking an increase again. So stigma is getting worse, which I think maybe might reflect a sort of skepticism and a backlash towards all this talking about mental health. Trying to think on a personal level, is stigma ever useful? I can't see why it would be. I think that, it does so much damage in terms of it's still like the number one reason, or one of the number one reasons why people aren't seeking help. And there are still certain individuals and communities where stigma is a massive issue. So I'm trying to think about why it would be a good thing. But then equally, I think maybe on a population level, there's a concern that if no one is stigmatized, then everyone's talking about this too much, and you get all these kind of confusion that I've been talking about today. So possibly, at a population level, there's a kind of optimum average level of stigma, and talking about mental health we should have.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting one coming up. what do you think is the risk of adolescents coming of age romantically and sexually in the time where AI companion apps are so readily available?
So this is new, and I think it's interesting because the often legitimate panic about social media is already starting to take a backseat to worry about AI. Actually, when Jonathan Haidt was writing his book, one of the things he was talking about was fear of front-facing cameras and people posting selfies, and that almost seems kind of quaint now that we've moved on to worries about AI. So the concern is that obviously it's very easy to I mean, this might seem surprising, but it's absolutely already been documented that it's very easy to develop a meaningful relationship with AI when you're an adolescent or an adult, and that that can be romantic. And the worry is that that means those people aren't having those experiences in the real world. So yeah, I think it's if it's preventing you from existing at all in the real world, then that's probably problematic. There might be some comfort to doing it, but I think it's so new in terms of documenting the impact, we don't really know yet.
Yeah. There's a question about sleep quality and whether this might be a key driver of young persons' mental health.
Yeah, so I think probably we should be talking more about sleep when we're thinking about this topic. It's pretty well established that adolescents are sleep deprived because their body clock shifts by a few hours during their adolescent years, and that means generally when they have to get up for a 9 o'clock start, they're kind of getting up in the middle of the night for their body clock, and that then has an impact. And there's a really clear relationship between poor sleep quality and risk of mental health problems. It's not my area of expertise, but I endorse it as being important. Yeah.
Wow, the questions are flowing in, so thank you guys. What is the effect of mental health awareness campaigns on health professionals? Do you think they're more likely to consider a mental disorder and a diagnosis of such?
I actually don't know. I mean, you would hope that the mental health professionals have their own training that mean they don't need a public health campaign to learn about it, but obviously that's not necessarily the case, particularly for more unusual problems. I don't know. It would be interesting to see what they, what a campaign could teach them that they don't already know and how it might impact their understanding of the problem. I don't know.
If I may just expand on that question, I think Lucy and I spoke earlier about a lot of diagnosis starts in a primary sort of GP environment, so would be interesting to see if this raised awareness overall is increasing a diagnosis through just the general practitioners and actually prescribe medication, etc., if there is more recognition in that primary mental health.
It's definitely true in the research that if you look through primary care records that more GPs now are recording anxiety and depression in their notes than they were 10, 15 years ago. But we don't know whether that's because more people are coming in with the problem, because their views have changed, whether there's some sort of incentive professionally to do it. So we know it's a component of it, but we don't know why.
There's a question that is specifically around suicidality and self-harm, and so it's asking, do you think that the fact that adolescents talk more about their suicidal ideation and self-harm can influence other adolescents to experience similar?
So this is really difficult because, like, it's well established that there is a contagious element to self-harm and suicide behaviour in adolescence. So one of the risk factors for an individual adolescent to self-harm is whether they have a friend who's already doing it. There is a social learning component to it that's very well established. So we know that, and yet at the same time, there's also this understandable drive to help reduce stigma around self-harm. So for the ones who are inclined to do it anyway, they know that they can get help and support from it. But I think those two things kind of butt up against each other sometimes. Like, for example, if you're going to go and give a assembly to 12-year-olds telling them what self-harm is, I think it's a really difficult balance.
Yeah. There is a question about a nurture and a social structure. Do you think it's having a contribution to a loss of stability? So, for example, high rates of divorce and lack of fathers living with children. Does that have an impact of?
Yes, I think it comes into that slide I gave about the kind of loss of protective factors. I don't know loads about it, but certainly it has been an argument put forward that that's one contributing factor, that there's less stability in the home. But equally, I'm always keen to say I don't think we should advocate for, parents remaining married or two-parent families staying together, actually, if that creates an environment that's worse than if they broke up. So I think it's not straightforwardly like we should always advocate for two-parent families no matter what.
If people want to ask questions in the room as well, we do have a couple of microphones, so feel free. There's a question down here from Akeem.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I wanted to ask about resilience training. So especially with, some people call it the mindfulness concept, where lots of mindfulness happening in secondary schools. And I'm not sure if it's the Myriad study or something, where people had the mindfulness resilience training and it actually had a worse outcome. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, the social contagion effect, does that happen irrespective of self-harm? So by that, if people are endorsing, school children are endorsing depressive or anxiety symptoms, is there the risk that that could spread to their peers, given, the influence on peer pressure, not peer pressure, but the contagion effect of peer behavior?
So the first one, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about, so I'll be brief about it, but there was a big enthusiasm about teaching resilience and coping tools to young people in schools, including some that involved mindfulness and some that didn't, including a big, well-designed, well-powered trial called Myriad, that was led by colleagues in Oxford, which you're referring to. So actually, when you look at the big, good quality trials, generally they tend to show null effects. So generally, the things that we had hoped would improve, like depression and anxiety symptoms, don't change. And actually, there's some evidence in some subgroups, in some interventions, that actually these universal mental health lessons can make young people report more symptoms. So it's a controversial, difficult area because there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. Some early meta-analyses, some existing meta-analyses suggest small positive average effects, but when you look at the good quality trials, it's generally null or negative. So the headline is that there was lots of hope that we could teach young people how to be resilient. It hasn't reliably worked out like that. Not teaching them all en masse. So you're more likely to get beneficial effects if you target the ones who need help. Second question was about social contagion. So nicely, my colleagues, Jack Andrews and Holly Crudgington, yesterday published a paper looking at exactly this, so about the social transmission of depressive symptoms. And it is true, so you can see a spread in social networks of depressive symptoms in adolescents. It's kind of unsurprising, actually, if you think about it, if you're spending time with someone you're close to and they have depressive mood, that it might have an impact on your own mood. So we knew that in the research from adults, and now this new paper has shown that it's happening in adolescents as well.
Hello.
Yeah, there's a question middle back here.
Hi, yes, lovely talk. I just had a question or two relating to how specific content exposure may impact adolescent mental health. And that could be either exposure on social media or through different campaigns. But I'm just curious about what effects you may see related to, content specifically about mental health and identifying those specific anxieties or traits within yourself, and then more, social injustices and political, advocacy related content, and, do they compound each other or affect different groups? Because, I think in adolescence, advocacy tends to grow a lot in that period. So I'm just kind of curious if we're maybe seeing, with increase of social media, also more exposure to political advocacy and all those things, and maybe that may contribute to higher rates. Just kind of curious on thoughts about that.
So the first question is about, the detail of the content that they see and whether the specificity of the message affects what symptom reporting it induces. So there's one study showing that if people identify more with the person in the post talking about their anxiety, then they're more likely to be induced to self-diagnose with anxiety. So I think that's kind of intuitive. It makes sense that if you see someone who you think is like you, saying that they have a mental health problem, that you might then be more likely to think it applies to you as well. The second question about advocacy, I think, is a kind of broader question, which is speaks to how broad the information is that they're seeing online and all the different routes through which social media content and activity might have different outcomes on mental health. So I think it comes to the idea that we can't treat social media as just one thing, and actually one really good thing could be that they're learning about causes that they then want to contribute to and contribute to activism. And actually it's a few people have raised it's silly if we're talking about reducing the voting age to 16 and simultaneously saying that they're not allowed to go on social media until 16. If we want them to be a sort of active member of society learning about the world, then a lot of adults now get their news and get their information on social media. So I don't know a lot about activism specifically, but it's just like one of many things that they're seeing that could be impacting them psychologically.
Thank you. Hey, greetings, salutations. Quick question. As a criminologist, I'm a criminologist. We identify if mental health is a cause or consequences. So my question for you is, I wrote it, so I'm gonna read it out. Is mental illness in vulnerable teens the primary cause of their behavioral issue, or is it a consequence of being trapped in a punitive system?
Yeah, probably both. And I think it comes back to the issue with school resilience training is it makes an assumption that that young person is able to go and practice mindfulness exercises and that the issue existed within them and that they can resolve it themselves. But actually, a lot of young people have mental health problems because they have incredibly difficult life circumstances, difficult things happening at home that cannot be easily remedied. So yeah, the relationship between stressful, difficult lives and mental health problems definitely go in both directions.
Brilliant, perfect. My last question to that one, two-part, but I figured you answered that first. Do you believe the current policies or social media worsen the problem of concept creep, or does it simply fail to see the lived realities of their current state?
Can it be both?
From your point of view, as a criminologist, I can see both. From your standpoint, which one do you think? If it's both, how is
Yeah, I think, tell me what you think from a criminology perspective. Why did you ask the question?
Okay, why I asked that is, thank you. The lived realities. I was just saying to this gentleman right here about stigma and shame integration. So your reality is it's okay to vape. And then by it's okay to vape, you think it's okay, I might have, I'm trying to think of a mental illness that comes from vaping. This is not my field, so I don't know. Yeah,
I don't think we know yet.
For that one. But whatever that might deviate from that, they may think, because concept creep is the idea that it's more than what is, right? Is in concept creep the idea that they're pushing an agenda that really isn't?
No, so concept creep, this is a term coined by this psychologist Nick Haslam. There may be other related terms, but his idea specifically is saying that words like bullying or trauma used to have quite tight boundaries around them and refer to quite serious, significant problems, and that actually those edges have been stretched to include milder phenomena. So concept creep it's actually, the way I was talking about it is this specific term by Nick Haslam, which I think is something separate to what you're saying.
Yeah, that it's a broader population now. So everything, bullying falls under now, adults can be bullied. Because most people don't realize that adults can be bullied at work. They think it just applies to children. So concept creep in this instance would include the adult bullying, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
So the reason why I mentioned that in vaping is, do they vape because they're bullied into vaping? Are they vaping because they're nosy? Because let's be real, kids are nosy, they just want to be nosy.
Yeah.
Or are they vaping because they see the parents doing it? Because remember, socioeconomic background and your culture allows you to do things that outside of norm is not norm. So to the rest of us, it's abnormal, but within that culture, it's normal. So that's why I mentioned that, because cultural factors also play on the mental health part of what you think is normal and what they think is abnormal. Okay, bye, I'm gonna take the mic now.
I did have a slide about why do adolescents take risks, but I had to take it out because I had too much stuff in there. But you basically capture all the different competing explanations for why teenagers do something potentially risky, like vaping. And you also touch on a nice point there, which I'll finish on, which is this idea of them following norms or social rules. They are getting different sets of rules from different circles and different places, so their peers, their family, their culture, etc. So all of those things will play into whether a young person or adult decides to do anything. Yeah. Okay.
We've just got time for one final question, which is Kamina just down here.
I just wanted to ask about the social media ban. So obviously you're against it, you've said it clearly, but is it because you think it's unpractical, or you think it's actually risking taking away a positive aspect of social media that then we wouldn't know how to kind of compensate for, if you like?
I think both. So I think my general view is that it would be good to have some sort of age restriction, but possibly that I would make it younger, because if it's say 13, then it's easier for parents to police behaviour at that age in a way that gets much more unrealistic in the mid-teen years, i.e. they can just defy the rules. And what's really interesting that's coming through from Australia is that the majority of them are just going on social media anyway. They download a VPN, they use their friend's face, they use a photo of a celebrity. They've very quickly learned how to overcome the age restriction tech that has been put in place. And the UK have not said how they will measure age in a way that's more restrictive or reliable. So there's that one element of that what we see so far from Australia and what we know about adolescent development is that they will just, not all of them, but a decent proportion of them will go on it anyway. And actually, as long as their friends are still on it, each young person will still want to be on it. Then the second component to it is that if we could wave a magic wand and actually stop them being on it, it would definitely have some benefits, like reducing access to problematic content, but we would also inadvertently remove the good sides of things, which feels really unintuitive to adults. But what they repeatedly tell us is that they enjoy certain aspects of social media and that they develop their friendships on it, their relationships, they understand the world, they understand themselves, they use it for relaxation, entertainment, education. So actually, and that there's specific adolescents who might otherwise or in previous generations be very isolated, who now have better connection with the world. So it's a bit of both, but all of that is still not discounting the risks, and everyone writing in this space completely agrees that it's a complicated problem that we want to do better on, but it's just that this specific ban probably won't do what we want it to.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy. Lucy warned us in advance that she gets lots of questions for her talks, and that's certainly been true. So apologies for the people who have submitted questions that we haven't been able to ask, but I think it's a real testament to your willingness to engage with these really thorny issues and hold this space for us where there aren't clear answers. So thank you very much for a really stimulating lecture.
Okay, thanks.